Thank you. Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. And it's lovely to be here. Thanks for being here. Out of interest or perhaps loyalty, there are some familiar faces. So that's great. It's great to be here. Before I get stuck into what I'd really like to talk about today, which is feminist killjoys and reasonable feminists, I'd like to start by winding the clock back to 2012. And that was when I was starting to piece together a doctoral project. I know that it's not always easy to just rewind 5 years ago, especially at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. So I've pulled together a few prompts that I hope will help you to stretch your minds back to 2012. So 2012 was the year of the London Olympics. Hopefully that's reminding you something. On a less positive note, it was also the year that everyone's least favourite operating system, Windows 8, was released. And closer to home, you might remember 2012 as the year of Marmageddon, as severe Marmite shortages struck the nation. So, and amidst all these events of 2012, and though we didn't know it, we were on the cusp of a remarkable surge in the visibility of feminism and gender inequality. So at the time, back in 2012, a lot of qualitative and cultural research across the Anglophone West had been showing a pattern of popular repudiation and disidentification with feminism, a silence about sexism. And as part of this post-feminist cultural moment, feminism was widely dismissed as out of date, as passé, and sexism was difficult to recognise. It seemed to be very difficult to name and challenge. Of course, this didn't mean that sexism was absent, far from it. Sexism was alive and kicking. But what seemed to be missing was a political feminist language for naming and problematizing sexism and gender inequalities. But at the same time as this was going on, the silence about sexism, an individualized rhetoric of choice, individual agency, and personal responsibility seemed to be making structural critiques of gender relations unspeakable and unintelligible in the mainstream. For example, this had been Joanne Baker's argument in her analysis of how young Australian women talk about their lives. Baker demonstrated how the concept of free choice functioned discursively to hide injustices and to render women individually and personally responsible for the structural difficulties they face. So here's what she says herself. The onus for success and responsibility for failure, despite continuing social divisions and disadvantage, lie with the individual. Thus, social pathologies of men's violence against women and the difficulties of sole parenthood have been re-individualized through a sort of entrepreneurial discourse, effectively privatizing personal experience that is structurally produced and profoundly gendered. So in the period between 2012 and the here and now, what had appeared to be a cultural moment of feminist repudiation morphed into a puzzling new shape. Sexism and feminism were no longer dirty words, and they're appearing, at least some of the time, as legitimate and worthy talking points in mainstream media. They are entering popular culture and seemingly general public consciousness. So what am I talking about? Well, this efflorescence of feminisms you can see up here might include examples as diverse as the transnational slutwalk movement, along with a wide circulation of feminist critiques of rape culture. And that was very visible in New Zealand in response to the Roastbusters case in particular, that I'm sure you'll remember. It was also visible in the explosion of feminism and feminist activism on and through social media platforms, like Hollaback and the Everyday Sexism Project. Also visible through particularly teenage feminist activisms and feminist clubs in high schools. That's something that we've also seen here in New Zealand, and something that might not have been imaginable, or certainly wasn't imaginable when I was at school, which I can now say was quite some time ago. Also visible in male and female celebrity feminisms, and feminist issues of mainstream magazines like Elle with Emma Watson, who's a bit of a feminist poster girl. It's also visible in the form of corporate, neoliberal, and choice feminisms of the kind of lean-in Sheryl Sandberg variety. And finally, it's visible in the marketization of female confidence and empowerment, which exhorts girls and women to love themselves and realize their potential. This surge in the visibility of feminism has taken many feminist scholars by surprise. Ros Gill, who's a key voice in debates about contemporary feminism, puts it this way. For the contemporary feminist analyst, the current moment, by which I mean variously this year, this month, and right now, must rank as one of the most bewildering in the history of sexual politics. The more one looks, listens, and learns, the more complicated it seems. And I'm absolutely with Gill on that one. The mainstream shift towards feminism gives rise to a whole suite of interesting and important questions. If feminist discourses and feminist identities are sort of going viral in a manner that was unimaginable a decade ago, how do we make sense of it? Could it be that feminism is trending? And what's the value of the word feminist anyway, if even Mike Hosking says that he's one? So I hope that you'll agree that while there is reason to feel optimistic about this renewed visibility of feminism, this new conversation that seems to be starting up around feminism and sexism, we need to do more than just welcome these developments. We need to interrogate them. What are the political implications of this feministification? And most importantly for today's presentation, what kinds of feminist identities and subjectivities are on offer? How might they work? And who are they on offer to? So what I'd like to do today is to use my research with a group of Auckland teenagers to dip into these questions. And I'll start with a brief overview of the research project before introducing the three feminist figures that I'd like to talk about today, figures who crisscross my various analyses that I've been doing. And then I'd like to talk over what they suggest about this new cultural life of feminism. So, onto the project. The research that I'm drawing today is my doctoral research project, supervised by Nicola Gathey and Jenny Brown. And the project set out to investigate young people's views and experiences of sexism, feminism, and gender in what was, back in 2012, an apparently post-feminist context, hostile to feminism, and hostile to feminist arguments that linked gender to power. The method that I devised was designed to offer participants opportunities to explore feminist perspectives and to interrogate that post-feminist common sense, as part of the research process. So how I went about doing that was I used a combination of group workshops and individual follow-up interviews to explore these Auckland teenagers' perspectives on sexism, gender, power, and the politics of knowledge, I guess you could call it. The first stage of the project involved running 3-day and 1-day participatory workshops. And I did that with a total of 23 young people from most certainly 5 different schools. The purpose of the workshops was to share feminist analytical tools and to invite participants to try them out, think about them. The full workshop process is documented in this resource that we've put together, which you can access on the Sexual Politics Now website if you're interested in having a look. So after the workshops, the second stage of the project involved interviews with workshop participants several weeks later. And I wanted to see how feminist ideas were sort of travelling with them down the line. What had clicked, if anything, and what hadn't. So to give you a sense of who was involved, I've summarised some of the demographic information for participants here on this slide. You'll notice that in the ethnicity column it doesn't add up to 20, and that's because some of the people who were involved had some unusual compound ethnic identities. So rather than listing what they are, I've broken them into their constituent parts so that it's not identifying for anyone who is involved. And just one more word on the research design. The breathing space between the workshops, where we all met and talked together, and the individual interviews was a really important feature of the research, because that breathing space allowed time for the ideas that we'd explored together during the workshops to sort of settle and shake down. In between the workshop and the interview, participants were continuing to reflect on their lives in light of some of the workshop content, in light of some of the conversations that we've been having. And they had time to talk through these ideas with the people around them, so friends, family, people at school. And that's something that I was able to tap into during the interviews. Now, as a result, these interviews were filled with quite detailed talk about feminism, about feminists, and about being feminist. And it's that material that informs the analysis of feminist figures that I'm going to draw on today. So that's sort of the project, briefly summarised. As you may have figured out by now, I'm from the School of Psychology and I'm a critical psychologist, which means that I'm interested in discourse and in understanding how experiences and identities are constructed, how they're made sense of. At the start of the workshops that I did, about half of participants described themselves as feminists, so that was interesting. By the end of the workshops, almost all of them did, so there'd been some kind of shifting process. That wasn't an aim of the workshop, but it was something that I was interested in. So during the follow-up interviews, I wanted to find out about what being feminist meant to these teenage feminists. What kind of feminist self were they constructing? And as I started to look through the quite detailed accounts I'd gathered from these interviewees about feminism and about being feminist, I was struck by the presence of what I'm calling feminist figures. Now, these figures are not figureheads, they're not real people, but rather they're personified shorthands that tell us what feminists are like and what feminism is all about. Now, it's not surprising that feminism was personified in this way, because discussion about feminism and feminists almost inevitably has a dispositional dimension to it. That is, what feminism is and what it is feminists really want arguments about those things tend to hinge on the question of a feminist's character. So what are her feelings? What are her real motivations? What's her behaviour all about? So these conversations tend to be very much personified. So what I'd like to do in the time that we have left is talk through the 3 feminist figures that really jumped off the page and came to life as I was conducting my analysis. And I suggest that these figures are important and worth thinking about because they help us to connect the dots between the kinds of changes I've described in the wider social scene and the tangible everyday possibilities that we might expect to find for talking about feminism and for being feminist. So as I talk through these figures, I'd also like to reflect on what each might tell us about the possibilities for being feminist today in this moment of apparent feministification. So let's begin with the killjoy, a figure likely to be fairly familiar to many of you from scholarship and perhaps also from personal experience, if you've been pegged as a feminist killjoy yourself. In brief, the feminist killjoy is a personified vessel for a repertoire of dismissive, damning claims about feminism. This figure encompasses culturally enduring ideas about feminism and feminists. So feminists are angry, they're unfeminine, they're unreasonable, they're bitterly man-hating, they're selfish, they're definitely humorless, and they're oversensitive. Throw that into the mix. So this figure, the feminist killjoy, comes to life particularly in talk about sexism. Some of you might remember Tui, the beer brand's response to the Auckland Women's Centre's critique of their sexist advertising campaign. So Tui is invoking the killjoy here by suggesting that feminists aren't fun, they're not cool, and they don't have a sense of humour. But the killjoy is also mobilised to represent a bundle of negative, pejorative claims that are more particular to the present moment. Claims relating to agency, to self-improvement and happiness. The feminist killjoy is an unhappy figure because she points out problems that other people don't see. And as Sarah Ahmed argues, the killjoy doesn't just point unhappiness out, she spreads it around, attributing her own troubles to other people, and in doing so plays the victim, which is not a good thing to do in the current time and place. You might recall the response to Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, which was delivered to the Australian Parliament, fairly directly to Tony Abbott and his cronies. And this is interesting because it's actually a very rare example of a high-profile, powerful woman directly calling out her political opponent for sexism. We don't actually see that happening very often, which is interesting. And what was the response? Well, she was absolutely vilified in Australian media, and she was vilified for playing the gender card, for crying sexism illegitimately to try and perhaps gain some kind of personal advantage. And you can see that in all these screen grabs of newspaper articles here. She's clumsy, but also manages to be manipulative. She's sort of boring, playing the woman card, how boring. But what she's doing is also indicative of her true nature. She's showing her true colours when she comes out and makes this kind of unfair claim. So pointing out sexism, and this is also true for racism and for other forms of discrimination, pointing these things out runs against the grain of neoliberal selfhood, wherein subjects are increasingly called on to distance themselves from vulnerability and from victimhood, to take personal responsibility for their circumstances and to work individually to transform themselves rather than to transform their situation. So that's the figure. What does the killjoy figure do? Well, I think the feminist killjoy is a bit like a discursive version of a scold's bridle. And this is a really horrible picture of a scold's bridle, which is a physical silencing device that has an iron muzzle and a spiked mouth plate. And these were actually used particularly against poor women who are considered troublesome or riotous, who needed to be silenced, basically. So punitive characterizations of feminists, I think, work in a similar way. So it's about punishing the speaker, but it's also about preemptively silencing others. The figure of the feminist killjoy protects male privilege by making women's challenges to sexism appear out of touch, appear vindictive and unfounded. So moving now to what some of the people I interviewed had to say. When the teenagers I interviewed tried to challenge sexism around them, they were often pigeonholed and shut down in precisely this way. So take Georgia's comment. She says, if you say something against sexism, then you're just a killjoy. Or they say, I was only joking. So you don't want to be that person. The feminist killjoy is that person. We might say that woman who no one wants to be. The killjoy is also a gendered figure. Tends to be women rather than men who she really sticks to. Just the presence of this figure, of the killjoy, made it difficult for the young women that I interviewed to challenge sexism and even to speak about the inequalities that were affecting women and girls. To avoid being positioned as a killjoy, interviewees spoke very, very carefully about sexism, raising their examples very gently, jokingly, and often taking care to point out the seriousness of the difficulties that we're actually facing boys and men. So putting the attention quite heavily on those issues as well. So the killjoy, I think, is part of an interactional choreography that makes sexism really hard to call out and challenge. So that's part of what I think Holly's getting at here when she says, well, what can you do? If you turn around and get angry, oh, it was just a compliment, you're overreacting. You keep walking, it keeps going. It's like there's no winning. So as a consequence of the circulation of this figure, the feminist killjoy, interviewees, and especially young women, had to work really hard to get their points about feminism across to others. Often this was done by emphasizing just how reasonable, how unthreatening and unkilljoyish feminism really was. So feminists are not out to slam men. They're not out to win unfair advantages. It's just a reasonable position that is all about equality. And you see that in the first quote here. So feminism's not bringing males down or taking women higher. It's just about us all being able to have the same rights as each other. This is where the figure of the reasonable feminist makes an entrance. As well as speaking about feminism as a fair and reasonable set of ideas, interviewees worked to personally embody the qualities of reasonableness that they claimed for feminism. They had to walk the talk. So Holly explained that her capacity to appear to others in a very calm and reasonable way was part of what enabled her to speak about feminism successfully. So she says, I have been able to change a lot of opinions. Well, not change, but open some people's eyes to what, like if I say, I'm feminist, they say, what? Because a lot of people kind of realize that I'm a clear thinking person, and just seeing a stable person and seeing me as a feminist is like, oh, they're not angry men haters. Okay, what? This is interesting. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the behaviour of a feminist speaker matters in conversations about feminism. When it's the character of a feminist that is being debated, the feminist speaker's own body and behaviour can be marshalled as evidence either for or against her. And as a result, Holly's capacity to embody personally a reasonable, appealing, and man-friendly feminism seemed to enhance her authority to challenge gender inequalities. But there's something else interesting about the reasonable feminist. At times, Interviewee's anecdotes suggested that the capacity to speak about feminism successfully, that is, to be heard as a reasonable feminist, intersected with other forms of authority. So consider Holly's description of a friend of hers who was able to talk successfully about feminism at school, which is no mean feat. She says, Rachel's quite popular, and she's really well known, and everyone likes her. And so I think feminism is cool if you're a certain type of person, because she's very charismatic, and she's very open, and she's loud, and she's fun, and she's cool. Yeah. So feminism can be cool if you're a certain type of person. Another peer, Meg, got far less traction on feminist issues than Rachel did. I asked what made it different, and Holly replied, I'm not sure. I think it's because Meg, it's just a high school thing of the labels that they put on you. Like, Meg's not as cool as Rachel, and she is passionate about her issue, but people see it as, oh, you're attacking me. You're just attacking me because you want to attack me. She fits the mold of a kind of angry feminist a lot more. So Rachel is cool and charismatic. Meg is not, and as a consequence is more vulnerable to being positioned and dismissed as an angry, unreasonable feminist, a killjoy. And although these interviews that I did with Auckland teenagers didn't draw attention to how coolness might intersect with ethnic and class privilege, I suspect that these axes of power and identity are very relevant to who is able to appear reasonable and worth listening to. So third and finally, I'd like to introduce the authentic feminist. And to explain this figure, I just want to talk briefly about authenticity discourse. What is authenticity discourse? Well, you only need to look as far as a cereal box to find it. It is the pervasive, morally inflected idea that we ought to live our lives authentically, that we must each figure out who it is we really are, and then honour that unique inner essence. In terms of its political force, authenticity discourse is, I think, very ambivalent. On one hand, the authenticity ideal and these exhortations to be the real you saturate consumer culture. These logics are often used by advertisers and self-help gurus in ways that end up reinforcing really narrow and sexist norms. For example, women are always being told and sold ways to liberate their true, radiant inner selves from unsightly hair, frumpy clothes, fat, wrinkles, negative thought patterns, hormones. The list goes on and on and on and on. So there's that side of authenticity discourse. But on the other hand, authenticity can be a really powerful, legitimizing framework for counter-normative identities. Authenticity discourse endorses difference, individual self-expression, and standing up for what you believe in. It's the message that you are entitled to be who you are, and that no one should mess with that. So the figure of the authentic feminist ties a feminist identity into this Western cultural idea of personal authenticity, self-discovery, and self-expression. And the figure works to align feminism with a normalized and normalizing canon of personal qualities, so self-knowledge, confidence, non-conformity, all these things that we really value. And many of the feminist teenagers that I interviewed took up this position. They described their feminist identities as a part of who they were, an element of themselves that they had discovered and that they were entitled to express. And in fact, that they perhaps had a duty to express. So Ashley explained that she had avoided, up until the point that I interviewed her, telling her really conservative parents about the workshop content and what we'd been doing and what she was thinking because of their strong religious beliefs and because of her perception that Dad believes in gender roles. But even so, as I was asking her about it, she described her determination to be feminist whether they approve or not. She says, "I'm not really sure what they would think. We haven't really discussed that issue, but I'm willing to be feminist whether they approve or not. It's my beliefs." Being a confident, independent feminist has further appeal in a cultural context where admissions of inauthenticity, low confidence, and vulnerability and conformity attract shame and censure. Being feminist could even be a mark of distinction in these circumstances, as Thomas's remark suggests. Oh, not everyone can accept themselves for who they are. Like, they can't accept their little feminist traits. Speaking as authentic feminists, participants sometimes found avenues to articulate and justify their opposition to the constraints and cruelties of conventional gender relations. So, for Holly, she says, yes, I'm feminist, okay? It's what I am. That's my opinion, my views, and I will challenge you if you make those kinds of sexist remarks. This figure is, I think, a helpful way into understanding some of the key undercurrents in the feministification of popular culture. The feminist issues and the feminist speakers who attract the most attention and the most support are likely to be those with some proximity to authenticity and freedom. So a woman's right to look how she wants, to wear what she wants, to feel beautiful in whatever way she wants, to work where she wants, without her desires being infringed on, either violently or implicitly, by others. So then feminist demands for self-determination and feminist politics more generally seem to gain traction when attached to this liberal common sense, which affirms that individuals ought to be free to live their lives without interference and without external constraints. And while it's undoubtedly good to see some feminist issues in the spotlight, it's important to note that some other less individualized, perhaps less charismatic, and perhaps more politically challenging feminisms and feminists remain hidden from view. So to tie everything up, where does this leave us? The three feminist figures I've discussed today help to shed some light, I think, on this new cultural life of feminism. They offer some clues about how we might make sense of this shift and the possibilities that might be found within it for being feminist and for talking about feminist issues. So the figure of the feminist killjoy personifies the cultural machinery that continues to make feminism actually quite a hard identity to inhabit still. The killjoy is put together from a whole heap of negative stereotypes about troublesome women. Some of these stereotypes are long-standing, so she is hysterical, unreasonable, and some are more particular to the current cultural moment. So she has a victim mentality, She's pointing the finger elsewhere and trying to avoid taking responsibility for herself and her own problems. The killjoy makes speaking about feminism risky and hard to pull off. And the force of this figure, I think, does seem to be enduring. So just last week, in a televised election debate, Gareth Morgan lashed out at femo-fascists overreacting to his suggestion that Jacinda Ardern was lipstick on a pig. Femo-fascist. No, that was a new one for me too. Seconds later, David Seymour had this to say. So, of course, David Seymour is a feminist, but he's the sort of feminist that says that we should be making everyone equal, not dragging people down. And sometimes too much of feminism is about dragging men down. It should be about making people equal. So despite this feministification of popular culture, being feminist and challenging sexism is not necessarily easy or straightforward, as many of the young feminists that I interviewed found out. On the other hand, the figures of the reasonable feminist and the authentic feminist tell us something about the conditions in which feminism is most likely to be easily inhabited and claimed. Both reasonableness and authenticity are powerful legitimizing logics. The reasonable feminist can speak about feminism so long as her behaviour is calm and affable, measured and rational. For the authentic feminist, being feminist is, or ought to be, beyond critique, because it's a matter of authenticity and free self-expression. Taken together, the feminist killjoy and the reasonable feminist can help us understand the renewed visibility of some feminist issues. They illuminate the somewhat restrictive conditions under which women are most likely to be able to articulate feminist ideas successfully, so long as she is reasonable and doesn't lose her cool, and particularly as she can relate her feminism to authenticity and personal freedom. My analysis has also highlighted how privilege seems to mediate who can inhabit feminism successfully. And looking around, it is young, cool, affluent, straight, conventionally attractive, young women who are most readily mainstreamed as, and I quote, the fresh faces of feminism. This, I think, is something to keep in mind at a time when certain feminisms and certain kinds of feminists are increasingly visible and valued in the mainstream. As we follow these kind of exciting and contradictory shifts, we need to keep hold, I think, of these questions of access. Which feminist issues are in the spotlight? Who can carry a feminist identity with ease? And who cannot? And that concludes my presentation.